The focus of our webinar is on understanding nonprofit organizations and the growing role that they play in the social and economic well-being of our community. And the ultimate question that I hope to explore with you today is starting a nonprofit the best way to turn your vision into a reality? So here is the plan for the next hour we'll be spending together. We're going to open with a discussion of community needs. We'll then explore the question if starting a nonprofit organization is the best step to address your identified community need. I will then be laying out 5 steps with many little steps beneath those 5 steps to starting a nonprofit organization. And I will go into some detail for those of you who want to learn about all of the building blocks in the process of beginning a charitable organization. And last, I'll leave you with some additional reading and resources that can help you to launch your nonprofit organization. Madeline shared with you by email in advance a 3-page handout that I created that lists these 5 steps in detail. And I'll make sure to share the link for you to access this tool again after today's presentation. So rest assured, you don't need to take notes on everything I say today. We'll make sure to give you some follow-up materials to help you on your journey. Now, please note, I have a lot of information to share with you today, but I hope to make this session as interactive and relevant as possible to your needs. And we're going to start today with a couple of activities to better understand who is here in our audience and what drew you to this topic. Then following the presentation, we will have a dedicated time of Q&A together. So if you have questions that you'd like to share with myself and Madeline and with the rest of the group, we'll have a time to do that towards the end of the presentation. So with that, I'm going to actually close my slides here for a second. And I would like to invite you to respond to a question in a poll. So it's helpful for me to better understand as a presenter who my audience is so I can be responsive to your needs. So if you wouldn't mind, just take a moment here to answer the question, who are you? Are you in idea phase for a nonprofit organization? Have you completed some initial work, maybe recruited a board, or you've developed a business plan, but you haven't yet begun operating? Are you currently operating a nonprofit organization? And, or do none of those describe you? And if so, just check the box for other. And then if you could type in the chat, just a little comment to explain what best describes you. So. I'll let you go ahead and answer that. And then when Madeline is ready to close out the poll and share back the results, that would be great.
It looks like we have almost everyone who has responded. So I'm going to go ahead and close it. And here's the results.
Okay, great. So most of you in idea phase, excellent. Looks like a couple of you doing some initial work. We're currently operating a nonprofit. And then it looks like a couple of you responded in the chat. Madeline, are you able to list those responses?
Yeah, so we have, as far as you want to know who responded where?
For the other category, were there any comments in the chat?
Yes. So we have one, they have a small business and they want to start a related non-for-profit. And then someone else is here as a volunteer for the community foundation.
Okay, super. Thank you. And then next, I'd like to invite you in the chat. If you could just share a sentence, a little phrase about why you're here today and what you're hoping to learn. That's going to help me as the presenter to make sure that I'm responsive to your needs. So again, if you can just share what drew you to attend this seminar today, and then what are you hoping to learn? So if you each could just take a moment to respond in the chat, that would be really helpful. Anyone care to comment? Any pressing questions that you'd like me to know from off the bat?
So we have two, or a
Great.
couple actually. One is my organization, the Independent Media Center, supports fiscally sponsored projects. So maybe learning more about that. Someone else, I feel a non-for-profit is a great platform to grow public interest about important ecological causes. We also have someone who'd like to know about the resources available to run and maintain a nonprofit. Another hoping to reinforce what they've already been exposed to and acknowledging that there's always room to learn more. And how to attain funding. I think we have a couple on cost and financial questions. And then lastly, wanting to know the ease, difficulty of starting and running a nonprofit.
Okay. Super. That is really helpful for me to know. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to touch on a lot of these during our time together today, including some of the costs that are associated, some of the essential steps in starting an organization. I'll share just a little bit on the funding piece, but I can definitely point you in the right direction of some resources for that. So great. Well, thank you all for responding to those questions. I appreciate that. Okay, so moving along, just wanted to share a little bit about myself and my background. My name is Genevieve Kirk, and what drew me into nonprofit work? Well, I'm originally from Northern Illinois. I was born in DeKalb, raised in the small town of Hinckley, and I got drawn into nonprofit work while I was an undergraduate at the University of Chicago. At that time, I was hired as a work study student and was later brought on as program director at Kids in Danger, which was a startup nonprofit located in River North in Chicago, addressing children's product safety. And it was founded out of a tragedy when a child was actually killed in his licensed child care facility when a recalled portable crib collapsed around his neck. They learned that he was the 8th child to die in this way. And the founders of the organization, whose child was tragically killed in that incident, began this organization initially to get the word out about recalled products that were still circulating, but then ultimately to make some systemic change so that children's products have to be required to have safety testing before being put on the market. So I learned from getting involved early on in this work that I am drawn to purpose-driven, mission-focused work that impacts community needs. And I've spent the past 20 years working in various nonprofit management roles with organizations across the United States, in Chicago, Milwaukee, the San Francisco Bay Area, a little bit of time in southern New Mexico. And 4 of those years I spent working with non-governmental organizations in developing countries in Africa. 2 as a Peace Corps volunteer in Mauritania, and 2 years in Kigali, Rwanda, where I taught English to university students who were survivors of the genocide. And I'm really grateful to have had those experiences as they've shaped my perspective and understanding of our world. The past 7 years, my family and I have been here in Champaign, Urbana, and I've had lots of opportunities to grow in nonprofit leadership during this time. I was the executive director of the Champaign Center Partnership, Champaign's nonprofit downtown business organization, for 3 years. And I'm an adjunct instructor in the School of Social Work at the University of Illinois, where I've taught classes in nonprofit sector and society and social entrepreneurship and social change. And this current role, which I started in August, is as the Center for Nonprofit Excellence Director at the Community Foundation of East Central Illinois. The Community Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit that's provided more than $21 million in grants and scholarships to our local communities since 1972, so nearly 50 years. We strengthen nonprofits through these grants and funding mechanisms, but more recently we've been offering trainings and resources through our Nonprofit Center for Excellence to help them implement best practices and be as effective as possible in achieving their mission. So that's what brings me to this work, and I'm so excited to be in this role where I can support both established nonprofits as well as individuals who are in startup mode wanting to address a community need through a nonprofit organization. So speaking of community needs, I'm going to invite your interaction at this point. I would like us just to have a little bit of discussion time about community needs that you're thinking about. So for those of you who are in idea phase or it sounds like a couple have already sort of started up. I'm hoping to address this with your organization. So if you can just share in the chat, or if you feel comfortable voicing out loud, what is the social challenge or community need that you would like to address or that you are addressing with your organization? And then secondly, why do you think forming a nonprofit is the best way to address this challenge? I'm going to pop open my chat so I can be watching your responses. But if anyone cares to comment on either or both of these questions, that would be helpful.
And on that note too, Genevieve, if you'd prefer, I can also unmute anyone who'd like to verbalize their response versus typing it in the chat.
Oh, that's great. I love to hear people's voices.
Yeah, so feel free to raise your hand if you would like to verbalize your response. Okay, I'm going to allow. All right, IRND, you're welcome to talk. It looks like you're unmuted, so I'm going to click on the ask to unmute.
Hello,
Right.
are you hearing me?
Great, we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, the nonprofit I'm trying to start is for elderly home health care, where you can send people to private homes to help people who don't have money to take care of themselves at their late age.
Home health care, great. And why do you think forming a nonprofit around home health care is the best way to address that challenge?
Yeah, because towards the end of life, you know, if a lot of people are discouraged, maybe people have Alzheimer or something like that, and they don't have enough money to take care of themselves. You know, through the nonprofit organization, you can provide the support that they need.
Okay, great. Thank you for sharing. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
I see it.
Oh, Dustin, I'm going to go ahead and allow you to talk.
Hello. Hi, am I on? Hi, can you hear me?
Sure can.
Oh, hey, great. Yeah, I'm a local guy here in Champaign, Urbana. I've run a small company about invasive species, about using the fruit of the autumn olive and making jam. I've made a variety of food products from it. I've got it in quite a few local stores. But the next breakthrough for me and for this business is to develop something with the other major species which is out there, which is honeysuckle.
Okay.
So I've developed a host of products to be made from honeysuckle, and it needs a business, but it also needs popular interest, and it needs people noticing that it's something to be used and not hated. So basically the whole program, the not-for-profit, turns people's attention around from the wasteful, hating way of treating our local species into a more productive way. And I think honeysuckle is a great place for that to start, and then it should expand to most other species that are on the invasive species list. So that's what I do. And connect with other people about it, yeah.
That is very cool, Dustin. Thanks for sharing. You sound like a social innovator. And I'm curious, I mean, you could have chosen to go for profit with your idea. Why are you looking at nonprofit?
I think it can use both, but not-for-profit is the one that is probably easier to start and is more practical for it, because it is more about a concept and gaining people's interest in and participating in it. Whereas the for-profit is for grabbing up the means of production and making profit for the stakeholders. And I think that's a whole different approach, which is great, but it does a different purpose than not-for-profit. Not-for-profit is not about making the profit. It's not about serving some investors. It's about serving the board of trustees And that's what I think is so valuable. With a not-for-profit, you get to gather a group of people who believe in your mission, and they are not getting paid by you. They just want to do it because they believe in your mission. And that's who you serve. The
Excellent.
of the
Yeah,
not-for-profit.
absolutely. That's fantastic. I love seeing your eye on the public good that can
Yeah.
be done. I would say ultimately that's the end audience of service. So yeah, thank you for sharing, Dustin. I appreciate that.
Yes.
And I'm noticing in the chat a couple others that social issues of violence in our community, yes, and prison gun violence ministry. Also another individual who's looking at debt, financial education. So thank you for sharing on these different social challenges. I think they're very valuable, and I'm curious to hear more from those of you who have an idea that's percolating on what it is and how you're going to go about addressing it. So without further ado, I want to get into some of the content for the steps to starting a nonprofit in the state of Illinois. Now, I want you to note that the steps I'm about to share with you today are compiled from a variety of sources that I will make sure to share with you before we close for today. It's definitely not an exhaustive list and should not be taken as legal or financial advice. These steps I share with you for informational purposes at this point. I do encourage you that if you have specific nonprofit creation questions, you're welcome to contact the Community Foundation. I would be happy to chat with you more about specific questions. So the first step in looking at starting a nonprofit organization is a step that I encourage you to spend some intentional, deliberate time on. And this step is research and planning. So some good questions to be asking as you think about forming a nonprofit organization. Is there a demonstrated need in the community for a new nonprofit with the mission that we envision? We have a solid plan for financing the organization during startup, but then also into the future. What are the costs to start up the organization? Where will I get not only the startup funding, but also operational funding to continue thereafter? How will this newly formed nonprofit demonstrate its impact? Is this the right solution and sector to address this need? And we'll talk more about sectors here in a moment. I particularly encourage you to think about that there are lots of different opportunities to form an organization. And is creating a nonprofit the best choice for your goals? There are many alternatives to starting a nonprofit, such as starting a for-profit corporation, a social enterprise, fiscal sponsorship, or partnering with existing nonprofits. And I particularly encourage you to get to know other stakeholders who are already working on this issue in the community. What are their programs and services? How is what you are proposing creating something different or a unique value? Is there a way that you could potentially partner up with their efforts and do something in collaboration with them? We would call that maybe collective action. This is really important for me to state this, as the reality is there are many, many nonprofit corporations in existence in our community, but there is some limitations to financial resources. So adding another organization working on similar issues will make for additional competition for funding resources. And I believe competition can have some advantages, but it can bring challenges as well. So I encourage you to do your due diligence and spend some time researching your issue. Who else is working on it locally? I would say even nationally. Are there national models in different communities similar to what you're proposing that you think would adapt well to our community of Champaign-Urbana? Why is that? And talk with those organizations and find out what's their secret sauce. What have they learned along the way? How can you apply some of those lessons to our community? So I'm going to go into teacher mode here for the next couple of slides. And that's because I've been asked the question in the past, why are there nonprofits? How did the nonprofit sector come to be? Like, why wouldn't everyone just want to start a for-profit? Hence the word profit. And the response to that question is kind of complicated. At the University of Illinois, I spent an entire class period answering that question in my nonprofit sector and society class. The short answer is to consider how nonprofit organizations are situated as a sector among the other sectors in our economy. So there are three major sectors in the United States. Most of you know for-profits or the market sector. That's our largest sector and employs the greatest number of people in our workforce. Behind that, so in second, we have the public or government sector, which is the second largest sector in the three sectors. And finally, there's the nonprofit sector. We sometimes call the nonprofit sector the voluntary sector or the third sector because it comes third in terms of how many people are involved. So the nonprofit sector is the third largest workforce in the United States. It employs roughly 10% of the American workforce, which is about 11.4 million jobs. So getting back to the question, why do nonprofits exist? There's an economic theory called the three failures theory that focuses on the economic efficiency of nonprofit organizations. And essentially, when the market, for-profits, and the government, public sectors fail to provide public goods and or respond to diverse demands that we see in the communities, that's where nonprofits have an opportunity to take on additional roles and step in to fill that gap. Nonprofits have some advantages in that they are nimble. They can be very responsive, community-based, where they know the community and can respond well to community needs. And they're able to respond when the market and government fail and or are unable to do the job well. So that's the short answer of why nonprofit organizations exist and how they came into being. But what makes an organization nonprofit? Okay, here I'd love for you to answer in the chat. This is a little yes or no question. The question is, can nonprofits earn a profit? I'm going to let you think about that. And if you can put that in the chat, that would be great. And I see in the chat, Miriam, the theory is called the three failures theory. I'll write it in the chat for you. And it's Steinberg is the economist who theorized on this. Steinberg. Okay. And so again, the question that I'm asking everyone, and you can respond in the chat, it's a yes or no. Can nonprofits earn a profit? Yes, no, or I don't know. And that's completely okay if you don't know. That's why I'm here sharing this information with you. What do you think? I'm seeing a yup, a yes. Non-for-profits can make a profit. Yes, but not in Canada. Okay, that's interesting. I'm not as familiar with Canada's rules. Yes, I think. Okay, yes, yay. Okay, great. You are correct. The answer is yes, nonprofits can make a profit. And really, as a nonprofit, you should try to have some level of positive revenue, which will allow you to build a reserve fund, which can ensure sustainability. The key difference between nonprofits and for-profits is that a nonprofit organization, when it makes a profit, it cannot distribute those profits to any private individual or shareholder. It's prohibited. The prohibition against private benefit is because tax-exempt charitable nonprofits are formed to benefit the public and not private interests. So short answer, nonprofits, contrary to what the name says, can make a profit and hopefully should. Okay, another tricky question for you. Who owns a nonprofit organization? I'm gonna pop open my chat again so I can monitor your responses. Who owns a nonprofit organization? So say I found the organization. Do I own it? Who owns it? What do you think? Go ahead and answer in the chat. Oh, interesting. Okay, I see two people think it's the board. Board question mark. No idea. Total, that's very honest. Thank you. I see a nobody. Okay. And I see that's Gregory Schroeder. Gregory, you are correct. So if you start a nonprofit organization, the answer is you don't own it and the board doesn't own it. The answer is, it's tricky, no one owns it, but everyone owns it. Okay, hear me out here. No one, because nonprofit organizations don't have private owners. As a founder, you are not the owner. They do not issue stock, they do not pay dividends. And while nonprofits can earn a surplus, that revenue, as we talked about, it's usually reinvested in the nonprofit organization to benefit or expand programs or to build a reserve fund, but that income cannot be distributed to persons. And also, unlike for-profit companies, nonprofits can't be sold to another individual or corporation. So if your nonprofit decides they're going to cease their operations, usually the organization must settle all of its debts and distribute all of the nonprofit's remaining assets to another nonprofit corporation, not to an individual, before it can be dissolved. So just to recap that, the founder does not own the organization, nor does the board or any officer of the board. These individuals operate in a position of trust and accountability for the public at large. So the answer is no one, but it's also everyone, because nonprofits are formed to benefit the public and not private interests, so for public benefit. Okay, so that's a tricky note that gets a little bit into the weeds, and I know it can be challenging to kind of wrap your head around that, especially if your background is in for-profits, but just some important differences that I hope you'll be aware of.
Genevieve, we have a quick related question.
Sure, go for it.
What happens if they go bankrupt?
That's a good question. So hopefully there will be a director and officer liability insurance that would protect those directors and officers from any personal indebtedness, in which case there would be no debts to settle, even if the organization is bankrupt. Yeah, essentially the organization would dissolve. If there's no, and they have no assets, then nothing can be distributed to another organization. And essentially those debts would need to be written off the books if there was that insurance in place. Does that answer your question? Okay. We can follow up a little bit on that as we move along. I want to get into some of the advantages and disadvantages of incorporating as a nonprofit organization. So why would you choose to start a nonprofit versus a for-profit? Well, there are some advantages, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. The first one, biggest one, is tax exemption. So organizations that qualify as public charities under Internal Revenue Code 501c3, they're eligible for federal exemption from payment of corporate income tax. So that's huge. That's a great advantage as a nonprofit. Once exempt from that tax, the nonprofit is usually exempt from similar state and local taxes. And if the organization has obtained their 501c3 tax exempt status, an individual or company's charitable contributions to the entity can be tax deductible. Another advantage is eligibility for public and private grants. So usually for-profits, you're not able to apply for that kind of funding, but foundations and government agencies, they're usually limiting their grants to public charities. So nonprofit organizations, they can also offer tax deductions to individuals and businesses that give charitable contributions. And then why would you do this in a nonprofit structure versus just, my own thing that I'm doing on the side, but I'm not incorporating? Well, some of this formal structure exists as a legal entity in its own right. So if you form that nonprofit, it's its own thing, separate from the founders. And incorporation puts the nonprofit's mission and structure above personal interests of the individual associated with it. So that formal structure piece is another advantage. And then with limited liability, under the law, creditors in courts are limited to the assets of the nonprofit organization. Founders, directors, members, and employees are not personally liable for the nonprofit's debts. But there are exceptions, and this gets a little into the weeds, but a person cannot use the corporation to shield illegal or irresponsible acts on his or her part. And also, nonprofit directors have a fiduciary responsibility. If they don't perform their jobs in the nonprofit's best interests and the nonprofit is harmed, they can be held liable. So it's important to, again, cover your bases with insurance. That's one of the 5 steps we'll be talking about here in a moment. But understand that there is limited liability that's offered, and that is an advantage of the nonprofit structure. But eyes wide open, there are disadvantages to being nonprofit. One is the cost. Creating a nonprofit organization, it's not easy. It takes some time, it takes some effort, it takes some money. There are fees required to apply for incorporation and tax exemption. There may be an attorney, an accountant, or another consultant that might be necessary for you along the road that will additionally charge fees. Paperwork. As an exempt corporation, nonprofits have to keep detailed records and submit annual filings to the state. and to the IRS by deadlines in order to keep active and exempt status. Another disadvantage is shared control. Although the people who create nonprofits like to shape and control their creations, personal control is limited. A nonprofit is subject to laws and regulations, including its own articles of incorporation and bylaws. And then last disadvantage is some scrutiny by the public. The nonprofit is dedicated to the public interest, so its finances are open to public inspection. Public may obtain copies of a nonprofit organization's state and federal filings to learn about things like salaries and other expenditures. So it's kind of an open book, and so that's just not necessarily a complete disadvantage, but something to consider as you're thinking about starting a nonprofit. Lots to consider. I'm going to pause here because I see there are a bunch of things in the chat that I haven't looked at yet. Anything that I need to take note of?
The only chat question was just the follow-up if the directors were liable during bankruptcy, but
they would not be liable if they have directors and officers liability insurance coverage. They would be good. They would not be taken, they would not be responsible. Okay. Great. Well, thank you for those questions. We're going to move on then in this first step. So assuming you're considering moving forward with incorporating as a nonprofit, here are your next steps. Defining your purpose and your mission. So part of the research and planning process is defining your purpose and mission statement. I work with organizations a lot and also just groups, community groups that are working together on issues to help them figure out what is that mission, their vision, and their values. So assuming you want to apply to be a tax-exempt nonprofit organization under that 501c3 section of the Internal Revenue Code so that you can solicit tax-free donations, your organization must be operated for exempt purposes, which I have listed out here on the slide. I want you to keep in mind, though, there are many other types of nonprofits that are not organized for exempt purposes. And in fact, did you know there are 29 kinds of 501c organizations that are exempt from federal income tax? For example, 501c4s. These are usually civic leagues or social welfare organizations. Organizations like Rotary clubs, those are usually 501c4s. I used to work as the director of the Champaign Center Partnership, which is a 501c6 business association, similar to the Champaign County Chamber of Commerce. So we were tax exempt, federally tax exempt, but we were not able to accept tax-free donations because we weren't C3. So there are designations, tons of them, for social and recreational clubs, fraternal associations, and so on. Here again, do your research to understand your options and which designation best meets your organization's needs. Other planning steps that I encourage you to consider. Market research. Okay, let's just pause here for a sec. What do I mean by the market research? What does that mean to you? If anyone wants to put a thought there in the chat. Market research, like how does that work for a nonprofit? Validation. Would people support it? Would this benefit people? Yes. Good. Good. Yeah, so market research, I think we mostly think of this as a for-profit term, but it's gathering information about your target markets, your customers, or in nonprofit speak, we would probably say clients. So with market research, our aim is to know about them, starting with who they are, what their needs are. So it's a really important component of business strategy and a major factor in maintaining competitiveness. And competition is going to be a reality for every organization, for profit or not. Next step would be recruiting your board of directors. So your first board will ideally be 5 to 7 unrelated, so not family member individuals who are responsible legally as fiduciaries for the organization's governance, finance, and legal compliance. So they need to be willing to attend meetings and to fundraise on your nonprofit's behalf. And at minimum, in the state of Illinois, you must have 3 directors on your board to start. So have that number in mind. You need to get 3 people who are going to be willing to sit with you and to govern and oversee the organization's operations. Next would be developing a business plan and a budget. So think about the first year of work at your nonprofit. You're going to need to describe your proposed program in detail and document planned expenses and revenue for the work. Who will you serve? Where will you serve them? What revenue will you secure? Whether those are grants, donations, fee for services that you provide, individual donations. Decide when your fiscal year is going to start and end. It may or may not coincide with the calendar year, and what accounting method you'll be using. If you've never written a business plan before, might I suggest that you consult with Madeline here at the library for resources on that. Also, the Small Business Development Center is a great place to ask for more resources with business planning. Looked like Madeline, you were unmuting. Did you have something to add on that?
Oh yeah, just that we have an amazing database that actually is for nonprofit business plans.
Oh, that is fantastic
Yeah,
news.
it's easy. Just pop it in those slots and it exports a beautiful plan at the end.
Well, that is new knowledge to me, and I'm so glad to know that. I will definitely be referring people your way.
I'll go ahead and share the link, but it's our Gale business plans, but it has a section for nonprofits.
Oh, awesome. I'm so glad to know this. Okay, next, you're going to want to do a name search and reserve your organization's name. So you're going to need to search the Illinois Secretary of State Department of Business Services Corporation LLC search. And this is to check on the availability of a nonprofit name before reserving your corporate name with the corporation division. This is to make sure someone else hasn't already taken your name. And if they had, you're going to need to think of a different name. You'll want to fill out the online form to reserve your nonprofit's name. And I'm also going to suggest, it's just my little tidbit, look at URLs and social media handles in tandem with this step, because I think it's super helpful when you're incorporating, if you can have unified handles and naming across all of your platforms. Moving along. Can you believe all of that was in step 1? I told you there's some sub-steps here. We're moving on to step 2. By the way, these steps get shorter and shorter as we go along, so bear with me here. Next will be appointing a registered agent. So a registered agent is basically an individual who's responsible for receiving legal notices on behalf of your organization. Your appointed registered agent must be physically located in the state of Illinois, assuming you're starting your nonprofit in the state of Illinois. So it's basically, where's your mail going to go to? But you do need to figure out who that individual is going to be. And usually it is the founder of the organization who's the registered agent to begin with. Next, you'll be filing your articles of incorporation. So this is a set of formal documents filed with the Illinois Secretary of State to legally document the creation or the incorporation of your nonprofit corporation. You can file this online, and you're going to need to use a credit card to pay the filing fee, which is $50. If you need to do it fast, expedited, the fee goes up to $75. Then you will want to publish a notice of intent to incorporate. This really should be done simultaneously with the filing of those articles of incorporation. The notice of intent to incorporate, it should be published with the county newspaper of record listed with the county clerk's office. So I didn't assume that all of you were from right here in Champaign-Urbana. Some might be from nearby. So check with your county clerk's office on where you should be publishing that notice of intent to incorporate. Then you'll want to file and obtain a federal employment identification number, EIN, from the IRS. This is just a unique 9-digit number that they assign to you to identify your nonprofit. You'll visit the IRS website to file for your EIN. Then you're going to need to draft your nonprofit bylaws. These are the main governing documents for your nonprofit corporation. They're just supplementing the rules that are already defined by the state corporations code. And essentially what bylaws do is they guide how the nonprofit is run. So Eventually, when you pursue federal tax exemption, the IRS will ask you to either attest to the fact that your bylaws have been adopted by your board, or they'll request that you even attach a copy of them to your application. So you need to have these bylaws in place. This document, it guides the actions and the decision-making of the board of directors, and it helps to prevent or resolve if there are conflicts or disagreement during the operation of your nonprofit. It will be very helpful for you to look at samples of bylaws, so you can model yours after a good template. If you need or interested in looking at some example bylaws, that's definitely something the Community Foundation can help you with. Then developing a conflict of interest policy. This is important. Policy basically ensures that your board and other interested parties, whether those are volunteers or staff, will avoid conflicts when decisions are made regarding the use of organizational assets or resources. For example, if I had a conflict of interest and maybe I'm a board member and I work for a particular company and the nonprofit is wanting to do business with this company, I would say, but I have a conflict of interest, so I abstain my vote on this particular issue. It's best practice to have your board members, and once you have staff, have your staff review and sign your conflict of interest policy, just in openness and transparency. And then hold your first board meeting. So members that you identified in your articles of incorporation, they will come together and then elect a slate of officers. It's best practice to assign at least 3 officer roles. Many nonprofits will assign more, but the only ones that are required would be the president or chair of the board, secretary, and treasurer. So that's why you need to have at least 3 people on your board in the state of Illinois. This meeting is required by law. It must be documented officially through meeting minutes. Other business that you'll do at this first meeting will usually be approving a mission statement for your organization, and then again, that conflict of interest policy. Okay, we're on to step 3, obtaining federal tax exemption determination. So this is basically filing for your 501c status. I want you to notice, because already you've done so much work, if you've gotten to this point, you don't have to do this step right away. You got time. So you can apply for your 501c status 15 months from the date that you filed your articles of incorporation. And sometimes, I mean, you might decide that you don't want to go for federal tax exemption, and that's fine. Some nonprofits don't. But if you want to, just note that time limitation, but that you don't have to do it right away. If you're going to proceed with this step, you would complete and file an IRS 1023 or 1023-EZ. You're going to decide which of these forms you need based on the eligibility worksheet, which you can find at the IRS website. There are fees for this. If you do the 1023-EZ, the current fee is $275. Form 1023 is $600. So take note of those costs. Several of you asked about costs at the beginning. Factor those in for sure. Okay, step 4, finishing your state filings. So there's a registration statement. It's this CO-1 registration statement for charitable organizations. This is required by the Illinois Charitable Trust Act and the Illinois Solicitation for Charity Act. You can find this form at the Illinois Attorney General's office. Then to request state income tax exemption, or this E number, organizations that are exclusively charitable, religious, or educational organizations, or government organizations, or other organizations that otherwise meet the requirements as a tax exempt organization, say if you're arts or cultural organization or qualifying senior citizens organizations, you will submit Form STAX-1, your application for sales tax exemption, which you can find on the Illinois Department of Revenue website. Oh, and we are at step 5. This is our final step. So assessing all your insurance needs for the organization. And we touched on the importance of insurance and just watching out for your risk management as a nonprofit. So think about the big picture. I mean, this will be general insurance, hazard, property insurance. But most importantly, directors and officers liability, or D&O. At a minimum, I would suggest that you purchase D&O insurance before you start operating. This is going to protect your board of directors and your officers from any claims that are made against them while serving. Okay, if you've made it this far, congratulations! You have officially started your nonprofit in the state of Illinois. That said, keep in mind there are other steps like annual maintenance requirements that you're going to need to be aware of that will need to be done on an annual basis. So just keep this in mind. All nonprofit corporations must file an annual report of officers and directors with the Illinois Secretary of State. Those forms will be sent to that registered agent approximately 60 days before the due dates. That's why it's important to know where your mail is going. If you fail to file this annual report on time, it may result in the involuntary dissolution of the corporation. And if you've put in all this work up until this point, you don't want that to happen. So check your mail and make sure that you get your annual report in on time. Another maintenance step is you may be required to file IRS Form 990 or 990EZ or 990N. This form selection, it's going to be determined on last year's annual gross receipts, and it's due 4.5 months after the end of the fiscal year. If your annual gross receipts are less than $50,000, so assuming you're really startup, have very little revenue in that first year, you'll likely be filling out 990N. It's the simplest of the forms. It's literally an e-postcard. As your revenue grows, the type of form that you need to fill out will grow as well. And by the way, they're great places where you can look up those forms if you're curious about other organizations and just wanting to see what their Form 990 looked like last year. You can find those on guidestar.org. I find that a fascinating place to research what other organizations are doing. Again, that's guidestar.org. Another maintenance step is the IRS. Illinois Department of Revenue and Illinois Attorney General, they may require other annual returns. Whether or not you must file those returns and which one you use, it depends in part on your status as a tax exempt or non-tax exempt corporation. So to be sure of your obligations, consult with those proper agencies and they'll tell you which ones you need to do. And then finally, following charitable solicitation, disclosure, and financial statements. So you need to look at those requirements closely. They can be found on the Illinois Secretary of State's website, and they include things like written acknowledgement of charitable contributions, and organizations must make certain documents available publicly. So you'll just want to check again, Illinois Secretary of State's website to find out what you need to do there. So I realize I just shared a ton of information that was probably overwhelming for many of you. Never fear, there are some great resources available on the internet that can guide you through this process. And I've listed a few of these websites here. The book, How to Form a Nonprofit Corporation by Nolo, lifting a copy here. This can be purchased or checked out from the library. It's applicable to any state. And then I've taken the liberty of documenting all of these steps that I've shared with you in today's presentation on a 3-page PDF that Madeline made available to you earlier. I am going to just pop that again into the chat right here so that you can access these steps that I've shared with you today. And if you're taking this webinar today thinking that maybe this next year is your time to start a nonprofit, or at least to consider your options further, you are in luck. The Community Foundation is now accepting applications for new and emerging nonprofits to join our Community Solutions Incubator. Oops, I skipped ahead. I was so excited to tell you about this. This initiative started back in 2017. The intention was helping strengthen and grow nonprofit social change agents in our community. Our 2022 cohort of Incubator members will convene in January for an event to kick off the new year, and participating members will have access to 8 educational sessions. Those are held one a month on nonprofit startup topics, which are led by guest speakers, very knowledgeable in those topics. We'll have 3 social networking events, And we'll be offering hands-on guidance and mentorship. Also access to a well-resourced co-working space, which is located right here in the Community Foundations building up in our upper level. We are really excited to support the next generation of nonprofit leaders and to invest in social innovation in our community. So if this is a program that you're interested in, you can learn more on our website. The application is available there. It is due by the end of the month. So by December 31st is what we're asking for. There's the link where you can find more information about the Community Solutions Incubator. If you have questions about the incubator, I am the incubator manager, so please let me know. And I hope that some of you will consider that and see if it's maybe a step that you're interested in taking. Okay, well, folks, it is 12:52. It has been a pleasure sharing all of this information with you today. I have listed my contact information for you here on this final slide. And I would just like to open up in these last few minutes that we have together a time for Q&A. So what questions can I answer? And I will open my chat so I can see them.
And it looks like we do have a hand raised. So Aaron Day, I can definitely allow you to talk again if you would like to say something. Ask a question. And that also extends to anyone else.
I'm just popping in the chat because there was a question earlier about the website where you can look up nonprofits, and I just put it in. It's guidestar.org. No, you do not need a subscription to get in and look at stuff there. I think they make you create a user thing so you can log in, but it's free. And it's fascinating. You're going to find out a lot of information about nonprofits through guidestar.org.
All right, Genevieve, it looks like we do have a question in chat. What sector do you think there is the most need for our community?
Oh, gosh, that's a good question. I wouldn't necessarily identify a particular sector in most need. I would think more in like topical issues of, what are those pressing community needs? And there are people and entities that are doing surveys on this all the time, particularly in different interest groups, among women, among children, among people of color, among, you can name a bunch of things. I don't know if I can speak exactly to those needs, but I would encourage you to look at needs assessments and surveys that have been done to identify that. And to think through, if there's a topical area that you're wanting to explore more, be asking those questions, be finding out who the stakeholders are that are working in that area that can enlighten you on that. And again, you do not need a membership to pay for GuideStar. You do not need it. It's free. And it's invaluable. So I hope that you get on there. I actually demo it with my students at the University of Illinois so they can see how to look up 990s for organizations that they're interested in.
And if you are interested in looking up 990s, we do have Federation Directory online, which
Awesome.
You have to be in the library in order to use this database. But I can help you get set up here if you're interested in learning more about grant makers, grants, find those 990s, all the good stuff.
And returning to just Mariah's question on sector, I think how I'd encourage you to think about that is of the needs that you see expressed in the community based on your own experience, which sector might be the best one to address that, right? So is going about it in a for-profit corporation way, what are the advantages that that approach would bring versus a nonprofit? And there was some discussion earlier with, was it Dustin, about the community needs that he's addressing and how he's looking at it from a hybrid approach, which is cool. You can definitely form an organization or social enterprise that has both a for-profit and a nonprofit arm. So there are lots of different ways of going about this, advantages and disadvantages, of course, like anything in life. But I would encourage you to think through, like, how can sectors the different values that a sector brings address that problem. And then how do you align what you're wanting to do with what sector you're thinking can best approach that problem? That's a great question. That's one that we could kick around for a while. Are there any other questions? Good. Dustin, I'm glad to see that you're going to look more into the incubator. I hope you do. I'm looking forward to having some new members on board this next year that will have good conversations together and learn from each other and learn from some of these guest speakers that are going to come in and present on different topics. Did I answer everyone's questions? I know there were questions about fundraising and, how do you go about fundraising? I would say that's a whole session, like an hour-long session in and of itself. There are great resources for that. I'd be happy to talk with you about that. I forget who asked that question, but again, here you have my contact information. I'd be glad to chat with you about that. There are many different ways to look up funding sources, whether you're going about grants, whether you are looking at developing an individual donor base. I think I'd better want to understand where are you at with your organization to understand what are the different fundraising approaches that you might want to tap into. And thanks for the nice comments. I see some sweet comments. So thank you. It has been my pleasure to share with you today. And I look forward to seeing more and more social innovation in this great community that we have, and hope that many of you will continue to take part in that in whatever way, whether it's founding an organization, serving on a board of directors, being a staff member, supporting organizations financially through a donation. There's so many different ways that each of us can play our little part and our little piece in helping our community to be better, stronger, more equitable, and just.
Thank you so much, Genevieve. This was a wonderful presentation, and what a great way to spend our noon time. So before we end today's session, I'd just like to share on next Monday, December 6th, we do have another business webinar. This is with Dr. Mike Yao from the University of Illinois. If you put anything on Instagram, maybe any content supporting a nonprofit you're engaged in or a business venture, I highly recommend you consider attending and learn more about how to protect your brand reputation. And also, if you enjoyed this webinar, feel free to check out our other events at champaign.org/events. And if you want to maybe look into the Gale Business Plan Builder for nonprofits, or even look at our other databases that support nonprofits, feel free to reach out via email. And you can just do that at mwolski@champaign.org, or just send us an email at librarians@champaign.org, because that's a bit easier to remember. All right. Well, thank you again. It looks like we didn't have any additional questions. Genevieve, thank you so much. This was an incredible presentation, and I really enjoyed learning all about how to start a nonprofit in Central Illinois.
Oh, well, thank you. Thanks for suggesting it.
Well, and this was a wonderful group that we had this afternoon. Thank you all for interacting, engaging, and sharing with us today. So I will leave it at this, and have a wonderful day. Thanks again.
Thank you.